So who do you listen to that you like for
Um,
like media?
oh, that is a good question. I'm kind of like, so this is where it gets really interesting. I listen to like a lot of different news outlets, but I actually consume not a lot of news, so to speak, right? So I will read through things like the New York Times and like the Washington Post and stuff like that. I'm also a big fan of like CGTN, which is really great. Um, but most of what I know about the world is like reading books, really, right? I read a lot and a lot of books, because the truth is things don't change that fast, right? For the most part, things don't really change that fast. And so like I think reading a lot of books to cover like the different historical background behind different countries is super, super critical, because then once you have that background knowledge, then when you do engage with the news, all of a sudden you can put it in its historical context, right? And that right there is like super, super critical. I'll often make this joke that being a Marxist means remembering the news from 3 weeks ago. Um, because like you'll just start to like notice things where um uh like one country that's our ally will all of a sudden become like the big enemy. So like for example, China, right? A lot of people don't remember the pivot to Asia, but if you look at movies, you can see the impact of the pivot to Asia, right? So if you go back 20 years, you look at the early 2000s, right? You can see a lot of Chinese representation in media where there's like buddy cop movies where, a Chinese cop and an American cop, they're working together to like solve crimes in France or something like that. And China's painted as like, an ally of the United States, and their government is painted as being friendly. And that is because, right, obviously, for like the decade immediately following Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China, the United States thought that China was going to be basically working for like American capitalists to produce things for us. Then as China started to outpace the United States in terms of economic growth, then all of a sudden you get President Obama with his pivot to Asia, which I think happened around 2012-ish, where now all of a sudden, as China's alleviating poverty, as China's like developing their own economy, they start putting restrictions on American capital. They start enforcing stricter environmental regulations. They start enforcing stricter regulations on things like housing to make sure that like the needs of the people there are met. And they are deprioritizing capitalism and like the interests of capitalists in China. Well, then you see the pivot to Asia, and now all of a sudden you see in movies, right, like the representation of China in the media all of a sudden becomes negative. And so really like reading books and like understanding like long-term history, I think is super, super critical. And then like reading a lot of scientific research is also really helpful. Like, so for example, um, when I was working on my master's degree in biosecurity and biodefense, I had to read through the history of the politics regarding like the Biological Weapons Convention. And when you read through the history of the politics around that, all of a sudden, all of the pieces fit together really easily. So like historically, like the United States has been the barrier to progress when it comes to enforcing international laws, especially regarding war crimes, for a litany of reasons, but especially because if you look at the Biological Weapons Convention in particular, um, the rest of the world, Russia, China, and the other major world powers that have signed on to the Biological Weapons Convention, they want an enforcement and inspection regime. They want to make sure that there's an international body that is not accountable to any one country, that can investigate biological facilities and make sure that no country is making biological weapons. The United States is the country that is actively pushing against any type of inspection system or program. And so when you start to see that, and then you start to research the reason why, and it becomes like, oh, well, they're afraid that other countries are going to steal our trade secrets and develop their own pharmaceuticals. And then, these private companies don't want, outside people coming in to like look at their labs that they're working with and things like that. Then all of a sudden it starts to come into play. And when you tie that into learning about the history of war crimes that have been committed, which once again was like something I covered in my master's degree, because obviously with biosecurity and biodefense, you have to learn about the history and usage of like different chemical and biological weapons. Then you start to realize things like, for example, the, handful of cases where the United States accused Iraq of having chemical weapons and then bombed a baby formula factory. Or the time that literally for no reason at all, Bill Clinton just bombed a medicine factory in Sudan for no reason, right? Like they didn't even really bother giving a pretense for that. They just, it's just that the Sudanese people they just had their own pharmaceutical industry that started developing. And then all of a sudden we accused them. In that case, we didn't accuse them of anything, but we just went and bombed their pharmaceutical plant. And then Syria is the more recent example where Syria basically said, hey, we're not going to follow American patents when it comes to pharmaceuticals. We're going to develop our own pharmaceutical industry. And then all of a sudden the United States accuses them of having chemical weapons. And so like these are the types of things where you need to understand like this long-term history. You need to understand this long-term history where um, like looking at all of that and seeing the way politics plays out internationally within spaces like the Biological Weapons Convention can sort of give you insight to the things that happen sort of everywhere else, right? And like, because the reality is, like, the United States doesn't care whether or not Syria was using chemical weapons. Like, they don't care, right? But the reason why they make the accusation public is so that they can justify bombing pharmaceutical facilities. And regardless as to whether or not they actually did have or use chemical weapons, right? Just like Iraq, the United States didn't care whether or not they had biological weapons or chemical weapons. They didn't care if they were using chemical weapons. They cared that they were developing their own pharmaceutical industry.